So good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to the first of the Victims' Rights Alliance webinar series for 2022. And apologies that we had to postpone the scheduled session 2 weeks ago. You're all very welcome. My name is Maeve Lewis. I'm the chairperson of the Victims' Rights Alliance, which is a loose umbrella body of NGOs and agencies working with victims of crime. I'm also CEO of 1M4. I'm delighted to invite you to this webinar, which is on online abuse and online safety. And we have two extremely interesting speakers for you today. The first is Dr. Maggie Brennan, who is an assistant professor of psychology at DCU, and her area of research or research interest is online child exploitation and abuse. So Maggie has worked internationally with NGOs, with law enforcement, cross-government forums, and social media companies. She's also co-founder of Cybersafe Kids and of the International Working Group for the Prevention of Online Sex Offending. So Maggie, you're very welcome. Our second speaker is Alex Cooney. Alex is the CEO of Cybersafe Kids and co-founder of that organization. Alex has a background in project management in the development world, and she was also the winner of the WMB Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2019. So Maggie is going to speak first, followed by Alex. Each will speak for about 20 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for a Q&A. We will be finishing at 10 to 2, but if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So Maggie, can I hand over to you?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Maeve, and thank you all for attending today. I really appreciate your time and your interest, especially on your lunch break when your time is precious. Very pleased to be here. So I suppose just to I'm going to set the scene and set the context for, I suppose, some of the information that we'd like to share with you regarding the nature of online harms. As Maeve has already mentioned, my area of expertise is in online child sexual abuse and exploitation. I've worked in that field for about 20 years now, and so I'm going to speak specifically to that domain of online harm, albeit that there are many other domains and many other categories of online harm that are of concern to us as those who have an interest in safeguarding victims and children. So I'm going to speak about the global picture, some of the challenges that occur in terms of offence presentation and victimisation, and also some opportunities that may exist, particularly in the prevention sphere for promoting online safety. And that's based on some of the consultation work that we've done through the International Working Group for the Prevention of Online Sex Offending, and through the sphere of a global study that I did for Interpol and ECPAT International, an international child protection NGO, where we performed an analysis of child exploitation and abuse material in the Interpol database. And I then hand over to Alex, who will speak about the work of Cybersafe Kids and the issues in terms of online safety, providing more of an Irish context and looking, kind of more closely at the work that they're doing, particularly around online child safety, prevention and education work in the Irish context too. So I'll just share my screen with you. Okay, so I suppose when we think about online safety and think about where the harm is at, I suppose it's important to acknowledge at first that the online safety agenda sort of maps onto, I suppose, the agenda that's kind of being, I suppose, perused at the moment through the relevant bill for the online safety or the online harms prevention bill, both in the UK and in Ireland. And essentially, when we talk about online harms, we are referring really to kind of user-generated content or behaviour that is illegal. So such as, for instance, images or videos of child sexual abuse, or content or behaviour that could cause significant psychological or physical harm to a person. Okay. And I suppose some of the challenges from us from a regulation and from a legislation perspective are that it can include both illegal content and behaviour, but also content and behaviour that is legal, but potentially problematic and harmful to those online. So it's a broad church of online activities and types of content and behaviour that we're concerned with here. So it could be online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which I'll abbreviate to OCSEA, but also then things like hate crime, hate speech, cyberbullying, online harassment. And I suppose some of the challenges from a regulation perspective is that some of these online harms and the nature of these online harms, how they're defined, and also, and most importantly, their impact on victims are really quite poorly understood in relative terms still. Our knowledge base in relation to these in terms of how individuals and children in particular are affected is quite young, and more work needs to be done in that space. The reason that is a problem is that where we have poor scientific understanding, poor scientific definition of a particular category of behaviour, for instance, or of its effects on affected victims, it creates lots of barriers and challenges to us. It can create opposition in terms of trying to formulate legislation to work against these online harms occurring in online spaces, on the basis of compromises to free speech, for instance. But also it acts as an impediment to regularized and standardized identification and reporting of different types of online harm, depending on the category of concern. And most importantly, it acts as an impediment. If you don't understand what kind of impact, psychological or physical, these kinds of harms are having on affected individuals, it's very difficult to develop appropriate response strategies for responding to the needs of victims who are implicated here. One of the other challenges that we have from an online safety perspective, and this is sort of illustrated there in the fifth point, is that in a review of the effectiveness of online safety programs that are designed, I suppose, educationally in particular, that are targeted at young people to respond to and help them to self-manage and to avoid becoming a victim of these online harms, what we find actually is that there is a persistent problem in terms of organizations who are involved in these kinds of programs routinely, I suppose, integrating research evidence about what works in terms of how they're designing these programs, the kind of messages that they're espousing, and also in terms of evaluating online safety programs. And that's not particular to online sexual exploitation and abuse. Indeed, it pertains to lots of other different types of online safety programs, such as those that are involved in combating, for instance, cyberbullying, or helping to appropriately guide children and young people on managing sexting behaviour and the associated harms, for instance. So I'm going to focus in a very specific way on one type of harm which has become a huge concern for us in recent years, and that's on online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And the definition that's offered here is really quite expansive. It's probably a bit less nebulous. It's more easily defined because essentially it is largely concerns activities that we know to be illegal involving children. There are a range of activities that may be implicated in this kind of offence. One of the primary ones is the production and dissemination and possession of images and videos of child sexual exploitation and abuse. We can call that child sexual abuse and exploitation material, and I've abbreviated it to that when we're talking about this kind of material. It's, I think it's still described in Irish statute as child pornography, but we don't use that descriptor because it is mischaracterising of the experiences of victims in that content. Also, online child exploitation and abuse can be linked to, for instance, the solicitation or grooming of children online for sexual purposes, but also commercial forms of sexual exploitation where children are being, I suppose, recruited via financial transactions into performing sexual acts, sometimes entirely via live streaming, webcam. The detection, our ability to detect and intercept those kinds of live streams is quite compromised as opposed to other materials where you have a permanent visual record. So there are a range of problems and activities that are implicated in relation to online child sexual abuse and exploitation. It has become a problem of considerable scale for us, and notably so since the advent of the pandemic, when everybody was locked up at home and people were moving online, I suppose, for the purposes of leisure and for social purposes as well. The indicators that are emerging in recent years are pointing to increases in online child sexual exploitation and abuse activity. So one of the indicators we have comes from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, which operates a cyber tip line which processes reports of suspected child sexual abuse and exploitation that are detected via online service providers on their platforms and services. Those are reported to the National Centre's cyber tip line, and that acts as a clearinghouse for sending those referrals, those cases on to law enforcement in the various countries and jurisdictions globally. Suffice to say that, since in September 2019, for instance, the National Centre received over 45 million images and videos of child sexual abuse and exploitation. This was a doubling of the reports in the previous year. Notably in 2021, the National Centre received over 29 million reports of suspected online child sexual abuse and exploitation. This is almost 85 million images and videos of child sexual abuse and exploitation. So that is, if you consider in the space of a 2-year compared, 2019 to 2021, that's a near doubling of the volume of child sexual abuse and exploitation material that was received by the Centre for Management. And just notably from an Irish situation in 2021, 7,237 NECMEC reports of suspected online child sexual abuse and exploitation were associated with an Irish geographic location. It's important to say that that's not an indication of the actual scale of online child sexual abuse and exploitation that's occurring in Ireland. It's likely much higher than that. These are just reports that are detected via US online service providers. So why is it increasing? I won't spend much time on this, but there are a range of reasons. So for instance, it's, I suppose, a response to the reality, the fact that children are more active and are, not all, but some children are more sexually active via their online devices. They're using their online devices and particularly kind of camera and image capture for sexual and for social purposes. And some of this is entirely developmentally normative. It's just the difficulty is what happens to this material once it's produced and shared with another individual. This is where problems can come into play and exploitation events and abusive events can occur. We are seeing, I suppose, an increase in access to problematic and illegal content, as well as children via online platforms, and also individuals who are implicated in these offences, who are, perpetrating these offences, can actually act with a relative degree of anonymity. And we sort of refer to this as the sort of troublesome AAA of accessibility, affordability of this content of the children themselves, and then obviously the anonymity that people perceive in their operations when they're perpetrating these offences. So just to sort of think about the nature of online child sexual exploitation and abuse, and particularly thinking about victim perspectives. And I would just say, I'll be speaking about this for about 3 minutes. I'm not going to speak about any specific cases or anything like that, but it may be that just in talking about the kinds of children who are particularly vulnerable to it, that some people might be a little bit upset by that. So if you feel like that and you wish to turn off your camera and mute me for a couple of moments, please feel free to do so. But there's nothing in here that's case-based, and it's very much just, and I understand that you're all largely professionals, but just to mention that. This is an analysis, I suppose, which I conducted, where it was a visual analysis of child sexual exploitation and abuse material that's contained in Interpol's international database of international child exploitation material. It's a database that's used by law enforcement for victim identification purposes largely. But it was, I suppose, the difficulty we had is that we have very little knowledge or insight into the actual abusive and exploitative experiences of victims whose data is contained in this database. And really, I suppose what we're trying to do is to try to understand more about the profile and the experiences of children who are featuring in this imagery. So I'll just share some kind of highlight findings with you from this. So the findings I'm going to share with you here, and I'm happy to share the full report with you via Maeve and her colleagues, or indeed you're welcome to email me for a copy afterwards. But the findings shared here relate to the second study. There were three studies actually in this paper, but study 2 was a study of about 800 series, so kind of, I suppose, linked sets of images and videos relating to specific children and specific offence locations. So you're talking kind of tens of thousands of actual individual files included in the analysis. In terms of key findings, it's really hard to be selective here, but I suppose just to say that in terms of the profile of children who were featured, so about over 60% of the children who were featured in this material were pre-adolescent, were prepubescent. 14.1% featured children of multiple ages in a single offence scenario. And then just over 25% of the materials examined basically depicted children who were of adolescent appearance. The one thing to say about this is that, notwithstanding the fact that we know through various surveys and longitudinal surveys that have been conducted over the years and across jurisdictions, including Savvy, for instance, that by and large, it is females and young females who are largely victimised in the context of child sexual abuse and exploitation. What was interesting here was that the male victimisation rate, so it was about 31% of image and video depicted boys exclusively, was actually quite much higher than other analysis that had been performed on this material. So other analysis until that point had suggested that males were victimised at a rate of about 20%. But this global analysis found that actually the rate of male victimisation was higher. Also, when we explored the severity of the sexual activity depicted in the images, we found that males were more likely to be depicted in images that depicted very severe and extreme sexual activity. That's not to say that girls didn't always also picture in those types of materials, but males were more likely to be victimized in materials at a very high end in terms of sexual abuse severity. Similarly, and very sadly, but I can only surmise because of their developmental vulnerability, again, very young children and particularly infants and toddlers were more likely to be featured to extreme and aggravated forms of sexual victimization. We were interested actually in the experiences of children who are, I suppose, depicted in materials that are largely legal, but are, perhaps sexualized in nature. And an interesting finding here was that when we looked at the children who were depicted in these low-level images, sometimes called images in the grey area, we found actually that these children were more often than not also subjected to more severe forms of abuse. So they were also depicted in illegal forms of child sexual abuse and exploitation material. So this speaks to the need actually to perhaps examine this low-level sexual material that is sometimes accessed by people who have a sexual interest in children, albeit legal in many jurisdictions, and to think about better ways of regulating that, given the inherent harm that this material in association with higher levels of material poses to children. I won't kind of say too much about youth-produced sexual imagery, except just to say that essentially we noted that the contexts of production were really quite complex. Here we had a lot of situations where we weren't just looking at simple sort of nudes and self-generated lower level materials. Sometimes there was very complex context of a production where you could see that adults were involved in coercing the child into self-producing content, and that there were clear coercive or deceptive elements at play in those production contexts. Also, we're not just talking about low-level content in this youth-produced content. There's a very wide range of sexual activities depicted in terms of the range of severity. And that was, of course, a cause for serious concern for us. I suppose the important thing to say as well is that from a practice perspective is that it really is important where these self-generation, they're not always, led by the child of their own volition, where these situations present, it's really important to thoroughly explore the circumstances of these children, the circumstances and the influence that led them to perhaps producing a sexual image of themselves, whether it was of a peer or of themselves, and to understand if they've been harmed in any way or indeed by a third or other party, as a mechanism to identify victims of child exploitation and also offence detection.
Maggie, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Maeve. So I guess I've spoken at length about the need, or I suppose kind of some of the challenges that present for us in terms of dealing with the specific form of online child sexual abuse and exploitation. However, I would like to speak a little bit about, I suppose, some of the opportunities that present, and particularly in relation to the ways in which we can actually work together to promote enhanced safety of children who may become victims of online child sexual abuse or exploitation, or to respond to the needs of those who have been victimized in this way. And really, given the scale of the problem that we're talking about, and given the limited capacity of law enforcement to investigate and prosecute every offence, this becomes, the question of prevention of these offences becomes very, very important. And it becomes actually a point at which we all become stakeholders in prevention, whether you're working in health or in social care or in the NGO or third sector. It simply isn't adequate in terms of formulating a response to this problem to rely on the efforts of law enforcement individually, who are massively under-resourced. And we've seen this in terms of the recent reports around the backlogs in forensic processing time for people who are found to be guilty of these, or who are suspected to be guilty of these offences. So we really need to develop a more expansive multi-stakeholder approach to this kind of problem. So just to sort of very simply say, what we did was we established an international working group for the prevention of online child sex offending. The reasons that we did this were to do with obviously the scale of the problem, the fact that very few international initiatives at that time were looking at the prevention of this as a more meaningful way of safeguarding children and also those who were implicated in these offences and their families. There were all sorts of, and there still are all sorts of structural problems in terms of case management. So caseload, people struggling to make risk-related decisions, and these all have public protection implications. The research base is pretty fragmented and it's largely locked up in academic journals around what works, and this needs to be made accessible to practitioners. And there's a lot of siloed working still. That's nobody's fault. It's just because we're all pretty snowed and working in this space. So we were trying to kind of, address some of these challenges. We did a number of things from a research perspective. We conducted a review of the literature. We conducted a range of stakeholder workshops and consultations, and we conducted a Delphi survey. So a Delphi survey or Delphi consultation, for those who don't know, is essentially kind of a gold standard way of formulating an answer to a research question where the evidence base is lacking. And essentially what you do is you work to achieve a position of expert consensus through consultation with experts working in the field. So we consulted quite a wide range of stakeholders here. I'm happy to make a copy of this report available to you. And we came up with a series of recommendations which are enshrined in the report. I'm sadly not going to have enough time to get into these in detail, but I will just speak to one or two of them that stick out, and the detail of the others isn't captured in the report. One of the points of consensus across the expert groups was that there would be some merit in introducing a public health type approach for the prevention of child sexual abuse, but adapting that approach for the prevention of online child sexual abuse and exploitation. So basically, this involves introducing earlier intervention methods that have an effect in the community before an offence takes place. So that could be, work like the work of Alex and Cybersafe Kids, working to reach potential victims through online safety messaging, but also helping to reach potential offenders before the need for law enforcement. So expanding the reach of anonymous helplines to help individuals to self-manage, increasing the use of public education, I suppose, pop-ups, to make people aware of what they're doing in certain online spaces where they might be vulnerable. And also another important point was that there was a clear consensus that we needed to have better collaboration with the online industry. And essentially, there are a range of issues here which are being redressed to a certain extent through the proposed bill, but there's a real need to standardise good practice across the online sector in terms of developing child protection responses within these organisations and improving how they interoperate with stakeholders in child protection outside of online platforms. Also, mandatory reporting for all online platform providers having a standardized child protection response and child safety investigation team across all platforms and services that engage with children, for instance. And also, I suppose, engaging with experts in online child sex offending and victimisation to help them to co-design features on the platform which may present a risk of offending or victimisation. So I'm going to just wrap it up there because I'm going to hand over to Alex. I don't want to kind of go over time. I'm very happy to share a copy of that report and indeed of the ECPAT International report. And just to thank you again for your time and for your interest. Thank you very much.
Maggie, thank you so much. I have to say, often as we hear this material, it's still so shocking, the extent and the challenges it poses to us all as a society. So I'm delighted now to welcome Alex Cooney, who's CEO of Cybersafe Kids, and Alex is going to talk to us about how to keep children safe online. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Maeve, and thanks, Maggie, too. That was a really interesting presentation. And I'll be picking up on a couple of the points, but this is more really an overview of online safety from the experience that we've had over the last 6 years since we set up Cybersafe Kids. And as Maeve said, Maggie is one of our co-founders. So it's great to be with her today on this panel. So Cybersafe Kids is a charity. As I said, we set up 6 years ago. This is our mission. I won't read it out, it's quite a long one, but it gives you a sense of what we're trying to do. We talk directly to children, largely in the classroom. So children in primary schools, although we have just launched a secondary school offering. So up to now, we've spoken to about 40,000 children aged between 8 and 13. We've also produced annual reports and trend and usage reports. So we gather data on the children and we look at it every year and we produce a report. So it really gives us a good sense of what kids are doing online, where maybe the vulnerabilities are, and so on. So we focus on the education. We talk to parents, we talk to teachers and others working with children, so social workers, youth workers, and so on. But we also work at the national level to try and influence policy and advocacy work. So that's a snapshot of what we do. So just briefly, we're going to take a step back and really look at how the history of the internet, because I think it's really important to get across how much it has revolutionized our world and the world of our kids, and how our kids are growing up in such a different world to the one that we did. And I'm assuming everybody on this discussion is an adult. So when we look back at this, the first multiplayer game, and you think how ubiquitous they are now, was 1979. And since that time, we've had the World Wide Web in 1990, the first webcam in 91, and the first web browser in 93. Hotmail, I don't know if any of you still have that email address, but that was 1996. Google, 1998. Facebook, 2004. And then 2005 YouTube, and 2007 the iPhone. And the iPhone, it really is an interesting one because in terms of making the online world far more accessible, particularly, well, to all of us, but particularly to young people, I think that particular launch has really changed our world. We have a computer now in our pockets, and it gives huge access. And we know from data that children make up about 1/3 of global online users, and largely see this online world in a really positive way. They see it as full of opportunity, full of exciting things. They love to game, they love to chat, they love to watch shorts, as my daughter calls them. They're really engaged in the online world, and there is no rowing back from that. I think we have to recognize that the world has changed. Kids are really connected both online and offline, and it's important that we recognize that, and we recognize the many opportunities. That said, there are of course risks. Now Maggie highlighted some of those, and particularly around the child sexual abuse and online exploitation areas, but we would categorize broadly just online safety risks to children are as follows. So just simply sharing too much personal information about themselves in a way that makes them vulnerable. Oh, sorry. I don't want to have clicked on something wrong there. There we go. Oh, this is not working for me here. Sorry. I'm going to just stop sharing, and apologies. I don't know what happened there with my presentation. Oh, now it's not playing ball for me at all.
Can you do from the slide after, maybe the one?
Yeah, I don't know why it's not. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Thank you. So sharing too much personal information, cyberbullying. This is actually often the reason that we're called into schools in the first place. Teachers are dealing with it in the classroom. In fact, from a survey of teachers last year, 2/3 of them were dealing with at least one and often more cyberbullying incidents through the school year. Exposure to inappropriate content. So pretty much anything you didn't want a child to see is available very easily online. Oh, it's up again, sorry. Impacts on health and well-being. So we know children coming into school, for example, tired because they've been up on their devices late into the evening. Impacts on self-esteem and because of comparisons with online. And then online grooming and extortion, which obviously Maggie has gone into, and we'll talk about a bit more here too. So I just thought this image was useful because it sort of provides a visual. You've probably seen it before. It's a visual of the internet. And I think when we think of the internet, we're often thinking of that top line surface web, you know, where a lot of these apps that we're using day to day are stored. Then you've got the deep web, which is where, you know, some of the kind of encrypted apps and, you know, our online banking and our medical records and that kind of thing is stored. And that makes up a massive proportion of the internet. And then you've got the dark net. And this is where it becomes really complicated because it's so hard to get things removed from here and to track criminal activity. And a lot of criminal activity is happening here. And some of these images that we talk about when they're going viral, you know, there's one thing if they're on the surface wire, it's one thing if they are shared between some of these surface level platforms, but if they are on the dark web, then they really are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to remove. So this idea that, you know, these things that once have gone viral are just out there forever, you know, there is a lot of truth to that. And then again, Maggie touched on this in her presentation, but the impact of COVID-19. Now, we all know that we were much more reliant on our devices than ever before, and that goes for children as well. They were spending a lot more time online. They were schooling online. They were, you know, getting their sources of entertainment, their social connections online, which were already very important and very, you know, the online connection was already a strong part of children's lives, and this only made that stronger. But we saw some worrying trends, and Maggie picked up on these, but this, as she said, the NECMEC increases of child sexual abuse reports through the cyber tip line, you know, just exponential increases really between 2019 and 2021, really worrying increases. And also online enticement reports, we saw huge increases there, which is, you know, people looking for sexually explicit material on children and contacting children for that purpose. Okay, just to make this a little bit more interactive, I'm hoping Kerry is going to launch a poll. So this is just to get a sense of how much you know about children being online. So this is some of our data that we gather each year. Thank you very much, Kerry. So these are two questions. So if you could just let me know what you think. So the first question is, what percentage of children aged 8 to 12 own their own smart device? And then the second question is, what percentage of 8 to 12-year-olds have been contacted by strangers through an online game? So this is data that we've gathered each year, and I'll be interested to know what you think. So if you could start filling in that poll. I'll give you a minute or two. And Kerry, when you think you've got enough responses there, then feel free to show the results of what people thought. Okay, so what percentage of children aged 8 to 12 has their own smart device? And we're very, very clear in the question that this has to be their own device and not a family device. And most of you thought 74%, which is pretty high, but actually it's 93%. And you'll be surprised to learn that this year, because we're just looking at the data from this academic year now, that has actually increased to 95%. So 95% of the children, so it was 93% last year, 95% this year, own their own smart device. So it could be a tablet, games console, smartphone. Those are the three most popular. And then the second question was what percentage of 8 to 12-year-olds did you think had been contacted by strangers through an online game? So most of you thought 35%, and I guess most of you also realized it was not down at the 12% level, and then we had some at 70% and some at 61%. So it's actually 61% from our data last year of children were contacted by a stranger through an online game. Again, looking at our data this year, which we're just starting to analyze and is based on 4,500 responses from 8 to 12-year-olds, it's actually 69%. So serious increases there as well. Thanks, Kerry, for helping with that. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the data. So I mentioned that we produced this trends and usage report, and we will again in September. And as I said, there are some increases that we're noting from this year's data. So this gives you a sense of some of the things that we're doing. It's a lot of information. Obviously, you now know about the smart device. 84% of them had their own social media or instant messaging account. Largely, actually, that's YouTube. YouTube's hugely popular, even though they're not necessarily actively posting on YouTube. The next one is TikTok. That again has seen increases. And some of this other data as well has increased. So for example, this year it's looking like around 27% of children have experienced something online that bothered them. And we're also seeing, when we follow up that question in terms of what children did if they did come across something that bothered them, which we defined as upset them, made them uncomfortable, or wish they hadn't seen, we found that about a third of children were not telling anyone about that, which is obviously of concern. And this just gives you the roundup. So you can see there, YouTube is hugely popular. TikTok, 47%, that's risen to 50%. There's increases on all of these. So Snapchat's up to about, I think, 45% this year. So these are where children are. These are the platforms where they want to be. And a lot of them, these are all children under the minimum age of 13. So they are accessing these online services well before the minimum age requirement, which is something we need to know, because, you know, they're not necessarily always getting the safeguards, the basic safeguards that are offered within those online environments. So we need to do a lot of work really to support and protect children in those online environments. And education is key, but we also need to put more pressure on the companies, which we can talk about a little bit more. So just then thinking about some of the stuff that children are exposed to online. So going back to that data point that I highlighted earlier around children seeing things online that make them feel uncomfortable. You know, we know that children are sometimes coming across porn, and it is a real concern. And there was a study done by the NSPCC back in 2016, and it was a survey of about 1,000 children aged between 11 and 16. It really was fascinating in terms of the data that it produced. And it found that 48% of the 11 to almost half of the 11 to 16-year-olds had come across pornography. Almost all of them had come across it by the time that they were 14, and 28% of 11 to 12-year-olds had seen online porn. So again, this is something we need to be really realistic about and start to address through our education programs, not necessarily using the word porn, but certainly talking about things like consent and boundaries and healthy relationships. And this stat here, there's 53% of boys of age 11 to 16 who have accessed online porn thought it was realistic. Again, I think this is an important one to highlight, because if this is where children are learning about things like sexual relationships, then, you know, it is deeply concerning in terms of how that might then shape their expectations and their understanding of sexual relationships. So it is something we absolutely need to be aware of. And just today, initially, earlier, I was asked to comment on a report that was published in some newspapers this morning about children being asked to send sexual images of themselves. And I know Maggie touched on this also in her presentation, but they found that a third of children that they surveyed under the age of 13 were being asked to share, were under pressure to share such images with their classmates. So, you know, this is, you know, really concerning data. And just, yeah, again, as I said, this is just a release this morning. Now, I wanted to show you this. I'm just going to unplug my earphones so that you can hear. Because when we talk about what we need to be doing about these things, is, you know, education is absolutely key. And this, some of you may have seen it, and apologies if you have, but it was launched as part of a Keep It Real online campaign by the New Zealand government. And I just think it's a very forward-looking, progressive approach, and something that we should be embracing here in this country, about acknowledging the fact that children are accessing content like pornography online, and that we need to do something about it, and we need to have conversations. So I'll just let you enjoy this. It's a minute.
Hiya, I'm Sue. This is Derek. We're here because your son just looked us up online, you know, to watch us.
Matt, darling, there's a thing we had to see you. So he watches you online?
Yeah, you know, on his laptop.
iPad, PlayStation,
His phone, your phone.
smart TV, projector.
Yeah, anyway, we usually perform for adults, but your son's just a kid. He might not know how relationships actually work. We don't even talk about consent, do we? Now just get straight to it.
Yeah, and I'd never act like that in real life.
Yeah. Hey, Maddie. You're right.
Okay, Sandra. Stay calm. You know what to do here. All right, Maddie. It sounds like it's time to have a talk about the difference between what you see online and real-life relationships. No judgment.
Many young Kiwis are using porn to learn about sex. Keep it real online. Get help and advice at keepitrealonline.govt.nz.
Yeah, so just really wanted to share that with you because I think it is a really helpful approach. It's addressing it head on, using humor, and you know, obviously it is a tricky topic, but it is one that we need to be talking to young people about. Oh, sorry. So thinking about then what we need to be doing, I want to look at this from three perspectives. Obviously legislation, and at the moment we have the Child Sexual Offences Act, which is great because it closed some loopholes and, you know, made an offence, grooming an offence, and holding sexual images of a child on your device or sharing such images. So that was an important piece of legislation that only came into effect in 2017. We have, as of last year, this law, the Harassment or Harmful Communications and Related Offences Act, more commonly known as Coco's Law, after Nicole Fox, whose mother really was very progressive in helping to shape and push this legislation forward. And this is really around the sharing of intimate images, and the idea of sharing them either, you know, with the intention to cause harm or without it. You know, it's making it now illegal to do so, which was a really important piece of legislation in the current context. And then upcoming, we have the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill. So this is currently, was just finished being debated in the Shannon, so it is getting closer to becoming a piece of legislation in the Irish context. And it really, well, it addresses a number of things, but it will also look at some of this area of harmful content that Maggie discussed earlier. You know, we know about illegal content. It is illegal to have, you know, for example, sexual images of a child on your device, but this is around harmful content, and it puts. The idea should be that it will put greater onus on the online services to manage harmful content on their platforms, to remove it when reports are made, and to be, you know, very responsive when complaints are made. So, you know, this is again very much needed, that we do put much greater accountability on the online services, who at the end of the day are profiting enormously from our time and attention online. And we do need to put more onus on them. You know, the tricky thing is that, you know, as much as they are putting safeguards in place, and some of the bigger, I mean, I'm sure you're hearing in the news, you know, the likes of Instagram and TikTok are doing some really interesting things in terms of child safeguarding for children who are 13 to 16 or 17 who are on there using their services. But it's often really just a sticking plaster. You know, for as long as those environments are really encouraging them to be in there, to stay on them, as long as they're pushing harmful content to them and pushing them down rabbit holes and encouraging connections with people they don't know, you know, really you're putting safeguards in to you know, you're kind of pushing against the tide on it, and it's extremely difficult. So we do want this piece of legislation to be robust. We want that accountability to be there. We want there to be an individual complaints mechanism so that people can make a complaint and can ask for harmful content to be removed. So we're still not clear if that will be the case, but we do believe that will really strengthen the legislation, because it will force companies to be really responsive in terms of complaints, because they won't want them to go to the regulator. So we'll watch that space with interest. There's a lot we could be doing on the education side, a lot more we could be doing. So currently, you know, it is addressed, online safety is addressed as part of the SPHE curriculum in primary schools, part of this myself and the wider world. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but it is also 23 years old. So it was last updated in 1999. And, you know, when you think, and if you think back to that quick snapshot I gave you of the evolvement of the internet, you know, so much has changed in the last 23 years, and we need our curriculum to be absolutely current and, you know, very much addressing the world that children are living in now, and looking at equipping them with the skills and knowledge that they need to manage themselves safely in those environments. Now, I believe there are updates coming, but they are long overdue. I mean, we really want to see this as the fourth R of the education system. When you consider how much, the extent to which children are living out their lives online, it is really essential that we are putting more focus and time and money into equipping them. It's not to put it all on the child. Obviously, they need to be supported by parents, they need to be supported by teachers and other trusted adults, and they need to be safe in the online environment. So we need more to be done there as well. But the education system is such an important place to offer really consistent information and support to children. And then finally, just looking at the area of parenting, digital parenting, this is a tricky one. When I look back at some of the feedback that we've had from parents over the years, this feeling overwhelmed is such a common phrase that I see and hear. It is, a lot of parents feel that on the back foot, that this is not the world that they grew up in. There's change, they weren't parented on it. It's not like teaching your child to ride a bike or to swim. They were parented on those things. There are supports, there are public awareness campaigns. So this is the new frontier of parenting, but we need to embrace it. We need to actively parent on it. It's so, so important. Really key that every child has a trusted adult. I mentioned earlier that not every child is reporting to a parent or a trusted adult when things are going wrong for them online. In fact, a third of children are not, and that is really problematic. We do want every child to feel that they have a trusted adult, especially when they're in that younger age bracket, so that they have someone to support them to navigate through really challenging times. So communication, boundaries, oversight, these are all really important strategies in terms of parenting. And it's not just about sharing the scary stories, or don't do this because, so-and-so found themselves in hot water. It's really making it a normal conversation at home, around the dinner table, before even your child has their own device or is being given access to, say, social media or gaming. Like, we're having these conversations, that they're well prepared and that we're supporting them and keeping an eye on them through that and having really good boundaries in place. We launched a campaign earlier this year called Same Rules Apply. We really wanted to get across, there's so many things that we do for children offline to protect them, which we consider to be in their best interest. They can't drink, they can't drive, they can't smoke. There's things, there's boundaries that we put in place. We need to be applying that same approach online. It should be the same rules apply. We need to parent children as much online as we do offline. So this is a little campaign video. It's just 1 minute again, and this is the final piece. Maeve, you're probably keeping an eye on the time there.
You're fine. You just have a couple of minutes. That's great, Alex. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'll just end with this is our campaign video.
As parents, we'd never allow this to happen offline, so why allow it online? It's vital to know what children are doing when they're accessing content and chatting with strangers online, and to talk with them openly and regularly about their online lives. Remember, online or offline, same rules apply.
Thank you very much.
God, that was an amazing video, Alex. And likewise, the video from New Zealand. I mean, I don't know if our government are considering something of that nature that would really get across. So look, thank you both so much. I have to say, I always end up feeling overwhelmed and a little bit helpless when I listen to people who really understand the huge issues facing us in the online world. So just to finish, if I could ask both of you, like, is there one single thing that you think would really help to safeguard children? I mean, there's all the multitude of things you talked about, but is there one standout thing that would really help to keep children safe online? So to Alex and Maggie, I don't know which one of you'd like to.
Will I start, Alex?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I suppose it's so hard to pin it down to one. There's an arsenal of things that are needed. But one thing I think that would be really helpful would be for there to be, I suppose, a greater a push, I suppose, kind of created for there to be a greater role for parents to become aware and to become more actively involved in their, and I'm saying this as a parent myself with all the guilt, because, you know, we have these conversations, but they're periodic. But I do feel that there are lots of ways in which parents could be more meaningfully supported. So, for instance, I think, you know, for instance, there's nobody who's going to know more about how to protect your child on a single platform or service than the service provider who deals with the reports of abuse and exploitation and knows about the kinds of things that are happening on the platform. So I think there could be lots of things done there, and they are happening slowly in order to, you know, perhaps suggest, you know, to parents that they could take maybe short little kind of learners on how to keep your child safe on a specific platform that their child is using. I think that's not beyond the wit of man or beyond the capacity of technological companies. And I think it would just also be quite a useful thing from their perspective in terms of fostering trust in the platform. I do think, however, though, that there needs to be a real standardization of how these kinds of cases are being managed on platforms.
And Maggie, why do you think the tech companies are so slow and dragging their heels? I mean, maybe that's naive. Is it commercial? Money,
yeah, I mean, these are largely for reasons of commercial sensitivity. So it's not going to look good for anybody's share price to sort of see your platform as being sort of, you know, I suppose kind of implicated in offences, you know, of real gravity against children. But at the same time, there's a balance of responsibility between commercial interest and child protection imperative, and I do think that that balance needs to tip in favour of a child protection imperative. I mean, I think any online platform who's offering services that they know are being used by children, there should be a moral and a legal mandate to make sure that they have a well monitored and well oiled and a standardized evidence informed child protection response. And you'll be really shocked at the amount of companies that still provide these services to children and don't even have child safety specialists on their teams, whether it's in terms of user experience design or responding to reports when there are problems in their platform. So
thanks, Maggie. Alex, what about you? Your one standout thing?
It is really hard to say the one thing. And we were asked recently through a sort of strategy process, like, you know, what would need to be in place for you to hang up your boots and say we're done, we've achieved our mission. And we identified 4 key things that need to change. But if you're going to put me on the spot for one, I'd say the 4th are that we are consistently educating children to a proper standard, because what we want is children to be critical thinkers online, so they can be asking these questions, you know, like, how is it okay that my data is being gathered in this app? How is it okay that I can access or my younger siblings can access? You know, we really need to be challenging this a lot more, and you know, I do want to put onus on the companies themselves, and I know I said this a couple of times, but they are profiting. Who is profiting the most from this time that we spend online, that children spend online? It is the companies, and they are absolutely not investing enough in those safeguards, those safety by design environments, and that is just not acceptable in this day and age. And any safeguards they put in place are merely a sticking plaster, as long as those environments are sucking children on, keeping them scrolling, exposing them to stuff, more and more extreme content, which we know is happening. There have been plenty of studies and evidence to show this, and encouraging them to get people that they don't know. So as long as it's literally a sticking plaster over those problematic areas. So we need to put a lot more onus. We need to ensure that children are safe online through education, but that those environments are safer for children. And whether that's just acknowledging behind the scenes through the algorithms, you know, this is a child of approximately 10. I therefore must tailor this experience for a 10, 11-year-old. You know, there's lots of brilliant technology now kind of evolving around facial recognition, where the company doesn't hold the data, a third party holds that data, and in fact doesn't hold any identifying data. You know, there's technology that can be evolved and developed so that we can ensure children, you know, because then we're going to have the metaverse here, and children will want to be in those environments, and those are going to be fully immersive and very real. And that's, you know, the next thing to worry about. So we've a lot to work out before we can ensure children are safe online.
Look, we've run out of time. So I want to thank you both, Maggie and Alex, so much. That was just a fascinating presentation. And I suspect people will want to hear more from you. So we might invite you and persuade you to give generously of your time again next year sometime. Maggie, you mentioned that you would make some documentation available if you wanted to send it to me. And if anybody then wanted to contact me at 1in4, Maeve at 1in4.ie, we can make sure that it goes to them. So listen, thank you both very much. There's some great feedback coming through there on the chat. So, and thank you to everybody for attending. Our next webinar series our presentation will be in September. So I hope everybody has a good summer. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.